try to drill in just a little bit with the chair. One was on how far he expected we should go in the whole area of regulation, both the burden of regulation in general and the execution of regulation as it related to competitiveness of investment, citizens, businesses in the district. And the other area of discussion with the chair was how far he expected in terms of the charge and the mandate from the council, how far he expected us to go in the whole exploration and investigation analysis of expenditure. And let me just ask a couple members of the commission who were on the call, on the briefing for the chair, to give us their perspectives. I'll ask Gregory and Yesham. Gregory, why don't your takeaway?
My takeaway was that on the regulation side, he was thinking it was pretty much a distinct and separate issue that he didn't think really fell within the scope of the commission. He also questioned whether to business people it was nearly as important as the pure financial things. And I think he summed it up by saying it's, I think, a rabbit hole. And if you started to go down it, I don't know how you get out in time. And he kind of had the same assessment about expenditures. He said he thought it would be helpful. That's why he had advocated for a long time ago to have an expenditure commission, which for various reasons never got off the ground. So he thought the most important thing we could do in that regard is to lay the groundwork to have the necessity to be followed by an expenditure commission to complement our work. And I think he also said on a couple of other topics, Mr. Chair, if you want me to go on, that he thought our particular value we could add would be to do primary research on a couple of issues and find out whether they're urban myths or not, about the competitiveness and the impact of taxes and personal taxes and the people that moved out or didn't move out, and if businesses really don't come during good economy and high taxes. And he says there's a lot of speculation, people disagree. He said it's knowable, and he said, why don't you do some research and let's put a fine point on it.
Yeah, nothing to add. Perfect summary.
Nick, would you add to that?
Nope. I think that's a good summary. And Erica is also on the phone. Do you want to add anything, Erica?
No, I think Greg hit it. That was good.
Thanks, Erica.
So I have to say that my takeaway is, I think I'd have to say that is an accurate takeaway of the chairman's views. They don't comport with what I would like to see, but the world isn't always as I would like to see it. I think to really fully explore taxation and the efficiency and equity of taxation, to look at not just the equity side, but the competitiveness side, I think you really should look at regulation, and you really should look at expenditure. How do we know what the burden is unless we know what we're doing in terms of expenditure? There are two areas of expenditure to look at. One is, do we have the right goals? We could have a perfectly tuned agency doing everything we expect it to do, but it's really not getting us where we need to go on, say, something like education or some aspect of social welfare. And then occasionally in the district, as in many cities, we may not only be going down the wrong road, but we're not doing a poor job of going down that road. That certainly exists in the city. But if those are off our plate, those are off our plate, and that's the way it is. I think it's too bad, because I think if left unattended, I think we could be put into a box where we're trying to solve for a solution, which is we need more money for the government. And that could be arbitrary and somewhat capricious, but we'll start moving down the road, to use a road analogy, and we'll revisit this. But for now, I think we have a pretty clear picture from the chair of where he wants us to go. And I think that's where we're going to be, unless there's some objection. Jim, we were talking about our briefing with Council Chair Mendelson. His view, the council's mandate, was it our charge to look at regulation and to look at government expenditure? And the short answer is no. Although he would hope that we would lay the groundwork for work by the council down the road and looking at expenditure by the district. That's I don't know where I was going. So okay. So We're now, I'm going to turn it over to Nick, and we're going to have some briefings for the council and for those who were watching, and then we'll have questions and answers with our briefers, but I'll turn it over to you, Nick, and once again, thank you for your work.
Great, thank you. Before I do that, Becky, do you want to say a word about
Oh,
dinner on the
sure.
17th? I just want to make sure that's on everyone's radar.
November 17th, we're having dinner at the Arc.
Best location in town.
That's
Awesome.
right.
That's right.
And we have invited all council members. We're hoping that at least a handful will come. And we will also be inviting staff from the previous taxation commission to attend, so they can talk about, you know, what it was like 10 years ago, challenges they faced, how their work was effective. So I hope everyone can make it in person November 17th. It should be on everyone's calendar.
So great, now on to the main event of this evening. We are thrilled to have three terrific expert speakers for our first expert briefing. The topic today is the DC tax implications of the post-COVID economy. As we've talked about in previous meetings, you know, we're convening at a moment when you know, when there's a lot of big questions about the economy, about where the economy is headed, what that implies for the tax revenues that the district receives, given our tax structure, and what that might imply for the kind of tax system that we want to have. In other words, as we try to inform and shape what the economy looks like going forward, what is the tax system, right, that's that best supports that. And this is explicit in the council's charge to the commission, that we think about the economic implications of the tax code. So the speakers today have really been invited to help ground us in the reality of what the economy looks like, what it will look like, what research is saying about this new world we're in, and the fiscal and particularly tax implications of that. So I will introduce them all briefly. Two of them are remote, one of them is here with us in person. And then hopefully we will, in this hybrid environment, make the technology work. This is the first time we've tried to do that, so bear with us if we have a little bumpiness along the way. We will start with a presentation by Dr. Santiago Pinto. He's the senior economist and policy advisor in the research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. He's a regional economist who will talk about the overall economic health of the district and its residents, and some of the long-term impacts of the pandemic and structural issues. Following Santiago, we will have Dr. Tracy Hatton-Lowe on my right from the Brookings Institution. She's a fellow there. She's a geographer by training, who will talk about the distribution of economic activity across the DC region, and how some other cities are responding to these economic changes. And finally, also, Dr. Pinto is online, and Dr. Howard Chernick is also online. He's a professor emeritus of economics at Hunter College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. He's a longtime veteran of the state and local tax field, and his focus is on cities and states. And he'll talk about the fiscal health of cities and how trends towards remote work may affect revenues and overall fiscal health. So I asked them to speak for a total of about 45 minutes among the three of them, and that will give us ample time, because I know you all are going to have a lot of meaty questions for them to grapple with, and you know, we certainly want to give them a chance to share some of their research findings and their perspective, but then we also want to have a nice, robust conversation. So I would say, if we could, you know, if they say something that isn't clear, or if there's a technological problem, we literally can't hear what they're saying, please speak up. But otherwise, we'll go through their presentations, jot down your questions, and then they will have a chance to discuss that once we're done. Does that make sense, Mr. Chairman? All right. With that, I will turn it over to Santiago Pinto with the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. Santiago, can you hear us okay?
I can hear you perfectly. Can you all hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Great. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. This is, I mean, I was just fascinated by the discussion that was going on there. So that
Hang on a second. Hang on a second. Yeah. How we do that? Can we turn the volume up a little bit?
Can you hear me well or not yet?
I don't know if that's so little. We hear you okay. Could be better. Not as good as it was last time, I will say.
Now, can you hear me better now or?
think that's good enough for me. So
I don't know.
be sure to really project.
I'll try to speak loud.
Work on the sound while you're speaking, but I think for the moment, you're gonna need to really project.
Can you? Okay. Go-
Thank you.
Okay, let me go ahead then. Okay, so no, I was saying that I was fascinated already with the discussion that was going on there. So and it's really very interesting, the discussion that are going on. So yeah, so I'm Santiago Pinto. I'm
Where is the speaker? And I'll move to it.
Hang on a second.
It's on.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is, something's not right. We're just gonna pause for a moment, so Daniel, while we figure
Oh,
out.
yes.
We can get you a little louder because we hear your voice, it's just not very, it's not clear enough.
I think it's best to do it.
Right. Yeah.
Definitely. Try again, Santiago.
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Is it working better?
Yeah, that's better.
Check.
Can you turn it up just a little more north?
Can you hear me? Let me see if I can. I don't know if I can.
That's better.
All
Can,
right. Clicking on different speakers. How about now?
can you hear me?
Yep, that's a lot better.
Okay.
Is it better?
Yeah,
Yes.
yes, that's good.
Okay, perfect, good. Okay, I'm glad. Okay. Okay, good. Okay. So, so I was saying, okay, so Santiago Pinto, I'm a senior economist and policy advisor at the research department in the Richmond Fed. Just I need to say this, especially on this occasion, that the views expressed here are those of the author and not necessarily of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond or the Federal Reserve System. So today, so I think, Nick, I will do like 15 minutes. Is that right? Something along those lines?
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So as you see that there's a lot of material that I prepared that is included on the slides. Obviously, I will not cover that material, but I just want you to have that as a reference in case there's some questions that will come out later at the question session. Okay. So okay, let me start providing sort of a big picture of where what I wanted to say. So as we all know that DC is in a unique position. From its standpoint of its public finances, we know that DC shares responsibilities and obligations generally associated with both the state and local governments, but at the same time, the DC does not have a full state taxing authority. And at the same time, like DC, like many other big cities, has significant spending obligations, especially as the uniqueness of DC is that if you see is a place that has a large low-income population with above average needs, and if poverty rate is usually above the United States. But at the same time, what you see is a very high per capita income per capita. This is so this is quite challenging, especially for the authorities that need to administer the public resources. So some of these uniqueness that I was referring to concerning DC is reflected on the revenue sources, right? So let me give you a very brief overview of where DC stands relative both to the U.S. and relative to its neighboring states, Virginia and Maryland, because I think it makes sense to talk in this particular sense. So let me start by looking at this. What you see there are a lot of graphs, lots of lines. I'll try to kind of tell you what I want you to take away from the slide. So this first slide, the graphs, they track general revenue per capita by different revenue sources. So again, this is the general revenue. And again, this includes, in addition to tax revenue, it includes intergovernmental grants and it includes transfers and other sources of revenue. But the main takeaways that I want you to take from this slide is first, one thing that you see here on the first slide for the U.S., that's the U.S., you see that charges, general charges, tend to be a strong component of state and local general revenue, along obviously with intergovernmental grants, right? And now, but when you look, for instance, in the case of DC, general charges per capita are relatively low. I mean, in absolute number, they are high, but you know, relative to other income sources per capita in DC, they are relatively low. Another thing that I wanted to point out is that for the US, you see the growth of the general sales taxes per capita has been relatively low relative to other revenue sources. Actually, especially since the last recession, since in 2009, actually individual income taxes have been increasing faster during the last period. Another thing that perhaps is important to look from this graph, also especially if you focus on the US, is if you look at individual income taxes, this is the yellow line there, and compare that to general taxes, you see that this yellow line kind of changes a lot more relative to the other one, the general taxes. And usually what people refer to this as kind of general sales being more stable source of revenue relative to income taxes. Again, I come back to this later, but I just wanted to point that out. Now, in terms of, if we now focus on, now let's focus on tax revenue, right? Specifically on tax revenue, and let's focus on the relative importance of each tax source within the tax revenue. So a couple of remarks again from here. Again, the graphs point look at the U.S., D.C., Virginia, and Maryland. And one thing, so what the main takeaways from here is, first of all, that property taxes are generally a strong source of tax revenue nationally, both in D.C. and also in Virginia and Maryland. Now, if you look at in D.C., general taxes are, in order of importance, if you look at general taxes in D.C., they are kind of third, right? While in the U.S., general sales taxes are kind of second in terms of importance in tax revenue. And again, what you see also point, the lines, for instance, the orange line, when you look at the U.S., the first graph, you see it's a lot, the orange line is a lot, you know, straight, and the other one presents some wiggles. The yellow line that represents individual taxes, so again, it's also reflecting the fact that there's more, you know, a revenue source that relies more on general sales is a little bit more stable than the other one. And again, another point here to consider also is about the changes in the general sales taxes. So again, since 2001, there has been a relatively decline in terms of the importance in tax revenue. And again, this has been despite there has been an increase in sales tax rates. And why? Well, people point that, you know, that there's a shrinking basically of the tax base, but mostly because there's higher purchases in services relative to goods. There's increased internet and mailing orders sales, and also because there has been also an expansion in exemptions. So you see also how, again, in terms of importance, it has declined a little bit since the 2001. Now, in DC, Maryland, and Virginia, you also see that the individual income taxes are very important sources of income, of tax revenue. And again, the other thing to point out has to do with corporate income taxes. So you see corporate income taxes being a relatively small source of income within the tax revenue, with the exception for DC, that is a relatively higher than what you see in in relative to the US and the other states. And there's so this is basically this slide is showing a snapshot by the 2020. This is the data from the annual survey of state and local government finances, and the last data point is to 2020. And basically, what comparing, for instance, the state and local tax revenue by sources, again, pointing out the main conclusions that DC basically tends to rely heavily more on individual and property taxes. It has a lower general and selective taxes than the US average, and it relies more on corporate income taxes than the US average. So you see, like in 2020, the share of corporate taxes was 8% relative to to 7 in the United States, and actually compared to Maryland and Virginia, which were 6 and 7 respectively. So these are all important things to consider, and I'll come back to this later. Well, I was talking about volatility, right? So in like states and local governments, they all need like a stable source of revenue. Again, mostly because most states, they need to have a balanced budget every year. And again, people have been pointing to the idea that sales tax are usually thought as being a much more stable source of income that they call recession-proof. But again, one odd behavior of the sales tax has been during the COVID, which has actually behaved in a completely different way. So again, historically, sales taxes have been more steady. There's something to say about what happened during the last COVID. So, but if specifically talking about DC and talking about the relative volatility of the tax revenue of DC, one thing that one indicator of volatility is the coefficient of variation, and what you see according to this, DC is not exceptionally volatile. It's kind of in the middle of the distribution. Another point is okay. So another I mentioned at the beginning when I was talking about sources of general revenue is the dependency on federal government funds, and this is something that we made a big issue before actually the pandemic recession. Because when we look historically, while the federal government has actually kicked in and helped a lot state governments during a recession in the past, that has not happened for local governments. So, but what we see right now is actually things had happened differently. We see like the federal government sending a lot of transfers both for local governments and state governments. Just in terms of, just to give you some context in terms of where the DC stands, so obviously the DC has a relatively large intergovernmental grants, but you see in terms of as a source compared to other sources, the relative importance of intergovernmental transfers have been declining through time. But again, it's always higher than any other state. The next, let me move a little bit to some of what perhaps was also mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that has to do with the relationship between taxes and mobility. So there has been a big deal about this table. Basically, what this is doing is using IRS tax data to account for where people have submitted their tax returns, and then data would account for migration and especially where people migrate. So there has been a lot of discussion about what has happened during the COVID. So the data, the latest data, the IRS data available is what we'll be tracking is kind of what happened during the beginning of the pandemic. So it doesn't take into account the whole thing. Again, we will need to wait for 1 more year to get this. But what has people been pointing out here is that actually DC has shown to experience a decline both in the number of returns filed in DC and the number of individuals, which again takes into account not only the returns but also the number of dependents, and also on the adjusted gross income that people report on their tax return. And again, there's been a lot of discussion about where are these people going, if they are actually trying to move to places where they can have lower tax rates or pay lower taxes. So here what you have on the bottom is basically where do people have migrated from DC, where was the destination, and where is the origin? Because again, this is a net flow, and the net flow is negative, but actually there has been people leaving and people moving into DC. Now, what you see is obviously a lot of people migrating or moving towards neighboring counties, basically Maryland and Virginia. But then you also see places that you will not relate to low income, low tax places like New York or California. But then obviously there are some places that go into Florida that is a place that is typically thought as being a low tax. And again, people moving into Washington DC, they come from again counties next to DC, but also from California and also from New York. So it's widespread. So again, this is something that that, for instance, the Tax Foundation has studied, and they can come up with something saying that something along those lines. So this is just reviewing some of the research or some of the work that has been done to try to establish a relationship between taxes and migration. So the Tax Foundation says, for instance, that during this period, 28 states experienced a net gain in net income filers, and this especially includes Florida, Texas, Arizona, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And 22 states and DC experienced actually a net loss. So even though the top states that experience a loss are New York, California, Illinois, Massachusetts, and New Jersey, DC is sort of very close to those five. So they claim, the Tax Foundation, what they claim is that actually they are the overall states with lower taxes and some tax structures, that the way they define it, experience stronger inbound migration. This is what their conclusions are. But then there is a lot of other research that not previous to the pandemic that have tried to study how do people respond to taxes. And again, the work is not as there's not a lot of research work in this area. And a lot of the research has focused on certain specific cases. For instance, there's this paper by Moretti and Wilson that they look basically at how star scientists respond to changes in personal and corporate income taxes. And what they concluded as state taxes, they do have a significant effect on the location of star scientists. Those are the top of the distribution, if you want. There is another paper along the same lines, but they look at the location of inventors. This is by Akshikit et al. And what they say is that inventors are less likely to locate in states with higher taxes, and they also calculate kind of the elasticity. How do people respond to changes in their in taxes? There's another recent paper by Juan Carlos Suarez Serrato and Ciudad. They look at the research analyzes every change in state corporate taxes since the 1980s and measured the responsiveness of business to tax changes. And the idea is that when factors are more mobile, they might be able to bear a lower share of the tax burden. So what they estimate here is that actually the firm owners they bear a significant part of the tax incidence, 40%, and the rest is distributed between workers and landowners. But their conclusion is that actually most firms choose to pay higher taxes and locate where the productivity is highest rather than chase tax incentives. So the idea is that taxes are maybe one possible factor determining localization decisions, but there are substantially other factors that might be relatively more important, specifically for some firms. Also a recent paper by Giroud and Rauch, they look at the impact of state taxes on business activities, and they also look at, when you look at taxes on business, you need to understand whether these are C corporations or these are pass-through entities or so on. So those are important things to take into account when you're looking at whether changes in taxes matter. So what they do find some elasticities, but what they what they find is basically that a lot of these things have to do with the reallocation of sources. It's not that new companies are created, but it's just reallocation of resources across location. Then there's also this discussion about, okay, taxes matter, but also we need to remember that taxes are used to finance public, local goods that might be relevant or productive for the firm. So in this case, there's a paper by Paulo Fachelbaum and some other co-authors that they look at. They find that actually the location of workers and firms are relatively more responsive to after tax real wages and profit than government spending. So even though government spending is important, taxes tend to dominate that effect. One thing that characterizes also DC is the fact that DC has an unusually large number of workers who live outside the city, right? So the inflow rates for yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, this is just a kind of,
yeah.
We're going to have like questions later, but this is just a technical question for people who may be watching and for us.
Yeah.
So talk about these metrics of elasticity. I think everybody gets elasticity, but I mean, how do we think about 1.8 or 1.9 in terms of impact, in terms of importance?
Well, so I mean, the 1 point, I mean, what it says basically, what this elasticity says, for instance, if there's a 1% increase in after-tax income in a destination state, right, relative to an origin state, then we will see a 1.8 increase, a longer increase in the net inflow of, in the case of the paper of star scientists, that will move to the origin to the state. So if you increase again, that's a 1% in after-tax income, right? So when you are reducing taxes, then you will see an inflow of 1.8% increase in the. So that's what the magnitude is saying.
Thank you very much. I think that's what's important for some of the citizens who may be watching.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
No, perfect. Okay, so I'm here. Okay, sure. So commuting is again is something. This is also what puts DC in a very unusual or unique situation, right? Is that the high percentage of people that are commuting from outside of DC. Now, there's something also that is important to remember, because this was something that was came up before the pandemic, and this is the issue that DC prior to the pandemic, it was the region with one of the longest average commutes in the country. And what you see is that what research says is that actually commutes tend to be longer in areas where housing is actually more expensive, and that's sort of what happened in DC. People cannot live in DC, so they live farther away, and they commute longer and longer and longer. So even though again the pandemic has declined, again it might be a temporary decline in terms of the duration of the commute, it is still something that was out there, and this was important, right? So let me skip this. So the issue of remote work, right? And this is related to commuting, right? So the idea was, as I was pointing out, there was people commuting a long time. Okay, now people have the opportunity basically to work remotely, and they will obviously take that opportunity. They will take it, and as we saw, this has been happening overall, like in the United States. Remote work has been increasing, and then I think it's kind of stabilizing around 30%. So this means percent of paid full days working from home is 30%, and it's also been something that we have observed in cities. Like the right graph shows changes in remote work in DC, and this is around 33.6 at this point. So the problem here is that these changes that we have experienced in response to COVID, again, this may have these long-term implications on tax revenues in cities, and especially this is important in places that rely a lot on commuters, such as DC. But not only that, also locations that actually have a lot of workers or jobs in sectors where it's easy to work remotely. So, and this is particularly the case in finance, management, and professional sector. So this graph, what it does, basically look at places that can be under higher risk, are those with a higher commuter ex ante, before the pandemic, and higher reliance on sectors that with a high probability of working remotely. And what you see, Washington DC is especially vulnerable in this case, in this situation. Now, one thing to say about remote work, and this is also something that has happened, is that basically what the research has been showing is that actually there are some people that actually change locations and move to a different state. But most of the people have actually moved from densely populated locations to less densely populated locations. So in the case of DC, they have moved from some areas in the central cities to the surrounding area. So this is important. So this is what people call the donut effect, right? So in a way, again, as I mentioned, there's people that have moved outside of the state, but a lot of people actually have moved, to a different, have worked to a completely different area, right? But a lot of people have actually moved on to the other side of the border, basically. I don't know how many more minutes do I have, Nick, or am I done?
Yeah, I can ask a question about that.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you don't mind, if you could wrap up.
Okay, let me so take up, because a consequence of more remote work is basically that there's less people in the office, lower occupancy rates, and so occupancy rates, this is tracked by the by Castle, right? Castle has some problems with the data, but but again, it's just when we're looking at changes in office occupancy. And again, it's the average in 10 large cities is 47.9. This is the latest data. In DC is around 44. And what we see is, again, obviously MSAs with greater work from home or working more remotely, they had higher increases in vacancy. And what research very recent paper has shown is basically the impact of this on the real estate market. So this is a recent study that focused on the New York office market. And what the study find is that in the New York City office market, there was a 32% decline in the values of office in 2020, and there's an expected decline of 28% in the future. The impact was different depending on the quality of the buildings. But what they basically say is that if you extrapolate this estimate to the rest of the country, this would imply that office value could be cut by nearly 500 billion in the next decade. And again, this will definitely have an impact on the public finances. And let me mention this, also obviously says tax collection is possibly associated with office occupancy. This is a graph, this is from the DC Policy Center that evaluates, the share of, the tax collection, the sales tax collection, and as a function of the share of workers that swipe their key cards, right? And this is just for DC, these are different dates, and shows a positive correlation between that. Okay, let me stop there. I have a lot of other things to say, but a lot of the stuff is on the slides. We can, and then we can come back later at the question and answer session. I stop sharing then. Oh.
Soon, and commissioners have the packets here, so if we want to circle back to those in the Q&A period, we can do that.
Perfect.
So I'm going to turn it over now to Dr. Lowe to walk us through her perspective on some of the changes going on in the DC economy.
Thanks, Nick. Get some more slides queued up. Okay, how's this? Can folks see my slides?
Yep.
Great. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to share some very recent research published just last week from the Bass Center at Brookings Metro, where I work. And I hope that this is helpful food for thought about DC's economic position as you contemplate our tax structure. I've also spent the past 2 months doing extensive interviewing and field work with your peers, city leaders, business leaders, and real estate professionals in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and Seattle. I've interviewed over 100 people, and I don't have anything but raw data from those conversations yet, but I'm happy to share some common themes and insights that are emerging from the conversations so far. So first, a little bit about us. The Bass Center is a center within Brookings Metro that uses a hyper-local place lens in order to explore and answer questions about the economy, the built environment, and communities. So here's what we're working on right now. This map shows a new economic geography that has evolved from the last century's downtown versus neighborhoods and cities versus suburbs. This is a new spatial, political, and economic reality where key places located across the old typologies of downtown, urban, suburban, exurban are where people go in order to access opportunity, share experiences, and connect regionally. So we're calling these places activity centers, but what they are in layman's terms is everything from historic downtowns to waterfronts to innovation districts and more mixed use walkable suburban town centers. So the first thing I want to make clear is that these are not the Metropolitan Washington Council of Government Transportation Planning Board's activity centers. Those are planning designations that are set through a political and planning process. We took the same concept of activity centers, but came up with a map that uses a 100% data-driven technique based on where assets like jobs are concentrated. And we have a typology of 3 different kinds of activity centers. There are primary centers. These are the biggest and most complex, most mixed use centers within a region. secondary centers that are primary centers except smaller, and mono centers, which are extremely big concentrations, high concentrations, but of only a single asset type. So this is what the DC region looks like in terms of the distribution of assets. And I've labeled here just a few examples of different activity centers around our region. Kind of like key first thing to note here as we zoom in on DC is that clearly downtown DC is the single biggest activity center in the region, and by a lot. It's nothing else is even close. So if we stop looking at the map and start looking at the data that underlie the map, what we see is that the land use base of DC is very different from the region as a whole, which really jumps out when we look at these graphs. But it's also important to note that activity centers as a group are actually pretty evenly distributed amongst all of the jurisdictions in our MSA. So DC and Prince George's County, for example, they have very different kinds of activity centers, but they have a very comparable like total number. So now I want to pivot to talking about why we would care about where activity is and what these activity centers are. I want to talk a little bit about the economic and fiscal significance. But it's important to note up top here that DC does not have all the goodies in its basket in terms of activity centers. Okay, so the first thing that we found in this most recent research project is extremely consistent with what Dr. Pinto was just talking about in terms of firms wanting to locate where productivity is high. We found that in metro areas with more job density in primary activity centers, or really any kind of activity center, we found that those places have higher productivity per capita at a metro area level. So I should say productivity per worker, my apologies. And we found that this correlation is even stronger than correlations that we tested for educational attainment of the regional workforce and for industrial composition. So for example, like having a lot of tech jobs in your region's economic makeup. So, you know, this is a finding that I am expecting a lot of people to be super surprised by, because I think in economic development, generally speaking, you're thinking like, look, an educated, like high talent workforce and tech jobs, that's the stuff that's driving productivity in US regions. But what we found is that agglomeration, that classic economic concept is actually even more powerful and remains very important. And this finding is consistent, you know, not just with the research that Dr. Pinto shared, but also with previous research from Brookings Metro, where we found that density and proximity generate more innovation. Specifically, in a 2017 Brookings report, Scott Andes found that universities located in or near downtown areas outpace non-urban universities on a range of innovation indicators. That's from licensing deals to the number of startups they're spinning off, which might help explain why advanced industry firms and entrepreneurs are increasingly moving to be in the orbit of those place-based institutions. We also found that the intense proximity of assets in activity centers yields a commercial real estate premium. So looking at the ratio of the amount of developed land area that's consumed by activity centers and then comparing that to the total commercial property tax assessed value located within them, we found that activity centers concentrate value while all other places consume more land than the value that they're generating. So basically, another way to read this figure, another way to think about this is just to look at this and to say, okay, the owners and occupants of commercial real estate are willing to pay a steep premium in order to locate in activity centers. This may seem like incredibly obvious and just like common sense to some, but essentially this is just yet another way of saying place matters to the economy. It also matters to residents. So what you're seeing here is the ratio of the cost of housing per square foot for housing that's within 3 miles of an activity center compared to all other housing in a region. And what we found is that in the Rust Belt, where there hasn't been a lot of growth in the US for a long time, there is homes near activity centers are actually worth less than other homes, but that in the DC region, really strikingly, homes that are located near activity centers are worth 66% more than other homes in the region. So this is like a staggering premium for people to be paying to be near these centers, especially given how many centers there are spread throughout our region, right? It's not like that hard to get close to one, but it's highly desirable to residents to be located near activity centers, and they'll pay a premium to do it. So once again, consistent with previous research, I think maybe some of you know my former boss, Chris Lineberger, and in the last project that we did together, we found that walkable places yield strong premiums in housing, retail, and office rents over those in drivable areas, and that in turn can have a positive fiscal impact on regenerating places. And this is essentially what we found in this report too. When we look at the walkability of activity centers, what characterizes these very dense places is that they are also more walkable. So in terms of other work that I'm doing that might be relevant to help you understand the issues DC is facing, I thought it might also be helpful if I shared this little bit of work from last year, where I modeled out the share of the workforce in each US metro area that is in office-based occupations. And then I plotted, that's on the x-axis, and then I plotted those shares against last year's office vacancy rates. And in most places, these vacancy rates have only increased since then. So what we're seeing here is that the regions that are out on the edge, on the right-hand side of this graph, have both very high shares of the workforce in office-using occupations and relatively high office vacancy rates. So this is a scary graph, seeing DC out there on the edge, because there's a huge share of the workforce using offices, which means we have a lot of exposure to office workforce trends. And even though we have this huge share of the workforce using offices, we also have high vacancy. And this is even scarier when we think about the fact that 30% of the region's total office inventory is in the commercial core of DC. That's the size of the size of the region's inventory is the size of this bubble. So the giant bubble right in the middle of the graph is New York. And then the big bubble labeled DC.
See, where is New York on there?
New York is the enormous bubble in the middle of the graph that's not linked.
Vacancy, not occupancy.
This is what I'm showing on the left-hand, the y-axis is vacancy as of Q1 of 2021. And in most of these places, it's only gone up since. So to temper this graph, I want to emphasize that in the big picture, it's true that the sectors of the economy that are growing the most are the office-using sectors of the economy. So new demand is out there. And prior to the pandemic, it was clear that there was a competitive advantage to firms in those sectors to locate their jobs near other jobs, regardless of whether that's jobs in their sector or just any other jobs whatsoever, right? This agglomeration effect that I showed on the first graph with the curve is very, very powerful. There's a huge productivity gain that accrues to employers when they locate their jobs near other jobs, and the more jobs, the better.
There was an article in the Wall Street Journal today or yesterday that some data is now coming in that firms are losing productivity in remote work.
That's right. And to be honest with you, I think that there was just a huge conference on exploring remote work, and the papers at the conference were a mixed bunch in terms of what we saw, in terms of what the implications of remote work might mean for productivity. But the vast majority of the literature that's out there shows a very enduring connection between productivity and place. And the fancy economics word for that is agglomeration. But, this is also like, to some extent common sense that like when you're on Zoom, you can talk to other people who work at your firm because you guys all have the same Zoom license and you have access to each other, but you don't know what you don't know. in terms of surprise connections that you might make when you run into someone getting off the metro. So returning to this graph, I'm glad DC is in Houston in that there's far less relative demand for office space in Houston. The problem is that what we found in other research is that regional is the wrong scale to think about this, right? The agglomeration effect that I'm talking about for knowledge sector jobs happens at the hyper local level. So it's not just like putting your jobs in the same region as some other jobs. It's about putting them in the same building, the same block, the same neighborhood. So the jobs that are clustering in activity centers, they want to be near other jobs, but those activity centers can be found in every region and in suburbs. DC is a leading region nationally in terms of activity center agglomeration. A lot of our jobs are in these activity centers, but that's why it's not a surprise that the office vacancy rate in downtown DC and in the suburbs right now is about the same. Suburbs they're not doing worse here, and they are doing worse in a lot of other places. Our suburbs are highly evolved. Downtowns are still the biggest and strongest activity centers, but it's not the case that there are no other options. So this is a competitive advantage to be maximized and leveraged, but not relied upon. I am also just now starting to look at actual activity, having made you listen to a presentation about activity centers. I'm starting to look at cell phone travel data and how it intersects with activity centers. And these are just some preliminary visualizations, not findings. So this is just a peek at what we're working on at the center right now. What I'm showing on this graph is that prior to the pandemic, downtown DC was the #1 job center in the region by far. By far. Nothing else was even close except other neighborhoods right next to downtown DC. Maybe a little bit of Tyson's. But when we look at trips related to shopping, prior to the pandemic, Tyson's was the #1 shopping destination in our region. So this is just an example of what I'm exploring in terms of more advanced typology of activity centers and trying to understand what's happening in them. In terms of implications for fiscal policy, I kind of summarized them here. I do, because of this productivity issue, I personally view more RTO as likely. And in the big picture, I think that DC has a strong core value proposition, but it is really notable that we're not leading the region on every metric. And we have a highly constrained taxable base. Other cities have this problem too, but certainly like the wolf is at the door in terms of wanting to, maximize the productivity of every parcel that's taxable in the city. And as I've been traveling around the country, I've been doing interviews in Philadelphia, New York, Chicago, and Seattle. And in every single one of those cities, everyone is worried that their tax code is the problem. This is something everyone is worried about, but also everyone knows that nothing is free. Services cost money. Cities have to raise revenue. Everybody gets that. The business community gets it. People get it. And so, it's not so much like the total mass of taxation. That's not the only issue. It also matters kind of the trajectory of the ways in which taxes are changing, how predictably and how fast. These are concerns for firms when they're choosing where to locate. No one wants to choose somewhere to locate and then get the rug pulled right out of them afterwards. So that is something that has come up a lot in interviews with employers. Head taxes, also a very, very big topic in the cities that I just mentioned. So that's it for my slides. And let me turn it over to our next presenter, and then let's get to discussion.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Loeb. Really looking forward to this conversation. Dr. Chernick, you ready to go?
Yes, ready to go. Thanks, Nick, for inviting me, and great to hear the two presentations. Very, very well done and interesting. A couple of reactions. Dr. Pinto talked about the tendency, as he called it, to flatten taxes and in states and in general reduce reliance on the income tax. And that didn't just happen. In my research, the role of the deductibility of state and local taxes plays a very prominent role in the willingness of states to have progressive tax systems. And of course, we cut that out in 2017 with the Tax Act. And this is the partly, it's, I don't think we have quite the econometric research yet to tie the two exactly, but to me, that's exactly what my own work and other work predicted. So we're dealing with a new fiscal environment here that was determined by the feds. Secondly, I did a lot of work back in the day with some DC lawyers who wanted to investigate the possibility of taxing non-resident income. And we wrote some papers and had a lot of fun. And of course, Congress rejected it. But I was struck by the extent to which the income produced in DC was earned by non-residents. By commuters, it vastly exceeded any other city in the country. And then it seems to me, if I could be a little bit over glossy, something happened in the district. And property values began to rise dramatically. Incomes, we saw that relative income of the district versus the nation that Santiago showed was really quite impressive. Something happened to DC and to some other big cities where their comparative advantage appeared to shift in favor of the big cities. And recently we saw that the income tax in the District of Columbia raised even more revenue than the property tax. So the problems go along with that, but something good happened to many and some big cities. Now, along came another shock, a big shock, and that's what the two speakers dealt with very nicely, which is the pandemic and the increase in work from home. And I think we still don't know the full impact. We've done a paper, I and two colleagues, that said, what would be the fiscal impact of the work from home phenomena? And we went from taking the idea that the greater the concentration of industries were of sort of office and office facing and people facing industries, information, management, finance, and professional work, the greater the concentration in those industries where people could work from home, the more at risk cities were. But the avenue for risk was through a decline in the value of real estate. And then in turn, the role or the importance of commercial real estate in the property tax, and then next, the importance of the property tax in the total revenues and finances of cities. So we had some surprising results. New York and San Francisco in that analysis are the biggest risk. Why? Because they have a very high share of total wages realized by the office using workers. So the value of commercial property was at great risk for a substantial decline. On the other hand, Austin, Texas, which we saw in one of the slides that Santiago had, everyone's success story is extraordinarily dependent, probably the most dependent of any decent sized city in the United States, on the property tax. So any hit to the property tax in Austin translates into a fiscal hit that is sort of dollar for dollar much greater than in New York, for example. Now, why is this? It's because Austin gets 50% of its revenues from the property tax and very, very little from state aid. So we come back to the point that why so little state aid in Texas and Florida? It's clear because they don't have a state income tax, so they don't generate much money. And that looks like a winner if you look at the flows of that Santiago talked about. But the new fiscal stress on cities, I think, is going to test that model very, very, very profoundly. The other reaction, in fact, to Tracy's work is, it's impressive to see the importance of agglomeration economies, and the question is, will they last? Is this shock from work from home so permanent and so major that that a city can, or a region can have great productivity strides while having many workers living in the suburbs and not commuting. And I think we just don't know the answer to that yet. I have, maybe it's a little naive, but having lived through the decline of cities and then the remarkable resurgence of Washington, D.C., of New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, I have, I don't know, maybe it's an unfounded faith that the qualities that made those cities attractive for young people and for innovators will still be there. There will be some period of adjustment, and city revenues are undoubtedly going to be under stress, which will call probably for some more spending restraint, which will be painful. But I think the forces that are propelling individuals and firms towards cities will ultimately prove to be stronger than the centripetal forces that are resulting from the work from home phenomenon. So that's about, those are some of my reactions. I individual slides, individual points, individual research, some of which, a lot of which I spent my entire career, such as is trying to rebut, for example, the idea that sales tax states are more stable in their tax revenues. Looked at it in the 2010 recession, published a paper, found it wasn't the case. Okay, so a lot of the conventional wisdom there, which I think we saw in Santiago's paper, I tend to disagree with as a contrarian. In any case, those are some of my reactions, and look forward to further interactions and questions and queries from all of you and to all of us, we speakers. Thank you.
And thanks to all of the speakers. So we now have a good chunk of time for some conversation and some questions for our speakers. Maybe just start off with an observation that I think a lot of what they've been talking about are things that already came up in our first two commission meetings. We talked about the state of the DC economy, some of the trends, the things we know, things we don't know. Norton's presentation 2 meetings ago touched on a lot of this. We're still in learning mode, and I know this won't be the last time that we have a chance to talk about these findings and the implications for tax policy, implications for our work. That's really what we're going to be doing for the next year. But this is the last time that we will have a chance to pick the brains of these 3 good folks. So with that, let me throw the floor open to questions.
Thank you for these presentations. I learned so much. I have some observations to share, and then Dan, a question to ask to all 3 of our guests. With Santiago's presentation, thank you, Santiago. It's always so good to hear from you. One point I want to make is your charts about our dependence on federal funding. They tend to end in 2017 and 2020. As you know, that we have received a lot of fiscal support from the federal government in 2021, which is bound to go away in 2 years. So we are looking at the fiscal cliff. So that picture has changed a bit. Just wanted to mention that. Tracy is such great research. I just want to sort of caution you that your analysis about housing prices being too high in places where there's high agglomeration, I don't know how you account for the land use restrictions, but these are types of places where DC is a perfect example. The demand is high, housing values are growing, but we also have both zoning, which is very rigid in its application, and also building codes, which are sort of like all wild and crazy, but they both increase housing prices. So I think it's something to look at. And Howard, your point about Austin's dependence on the real property taxes is a really, really good one. But we have to adjust it for sort of like the demand for places like Austin is growing right now, and demand for places like DC is not. So I kind of want to take your thoughts on that. But my one question to all 3 of our guests is, if you were sitting here among us as commission members, what would be the kinds of areas that you'd be looking at in terms of like reassessing the tax code? Thank you.
Should we go in the order that we began it? Dr. Pinto, you want to begin with on that one?
Yes, definitely. No, yes. I actually have some slides about that. I mean, you can like I think at the end I didn't get into all those kind of things. Is yeah. So thank you, Yasin, for. I mean, this is definitely. So a couple of things. So definitely these, and usually when you ask to the tax system, you ask a lot of things, right? You like to efficiency, equity, transparency, to have low administration costs, to have low compliance costs, and to generate revenue. There are lots of things that an ideal tax system is, how it can do that at the federal level. The challenges are even more problematic at the local level. These are all trade-offs that are really hard to have. Going to simpler taxes have trade-offs. You can go, make it really nice and simple, a tax code, but then there has some cost because then you have a lower ability to actually achieve other goals. So in the issue about, okay, how can you design a tax system at the local level that addresses equity when people can move or firms can move all over the place and avoid taxes or along those lines. Now, there are a couple of things to mention is that, and I think that was sort of going to something that Howard said already, is like, there are a lot of people that look at taxes, right? And actually, perhaps the best way to look at this, what it called it, will be the net burden, right? The net tax burden, which is how much you pay relative to how much you get from the tax system, basically. So again, there's so much that you can ask the tax system to do, and I think it goes back to some of the discussion that you were having at the beginning about looking at other instruments like regulation and expenditures and all those kind of things, right? So there's a priority that you have to say, okay, what do we want the tax system to accomplish, especially at the local level, especially in an environment where it become more competitive in terms of resource mobility, but at the same time is, you like, for instance, some people say, okay, let's move to, let's reduce income taxes and increase sales taxes, but sales taxes are becoming really problematic in the sense that it's hard to administer. There's a lot of things going on in terms of avoiding sales taxes. There's this issue about the economy moving towards a more service economy, and then reducing the collections on retail taxes. And again, this idea that at the end, if you move to a sales tax entirely, then you will end up with that more regressive tax system. So. And there's no doubt that if we look at some of the trends that I was showing at the beginning, you see that since 2001, you started to see a relative decline, at least in the share of tax revenue of sales taxes. They have not been growing in terms of per capita as fast as others, right? And so again, then there's this issue about being competitive and reducing every income tax, right? Or making it flat in some other places. But then again, you lose on other dimensions that the ideal tax system would need to accomplish. So let me stop here because I can continue forever, but I want to give the others to respond as
well. Okay, I'm going to answer your last question first, which is like, if I could make one change to I'm going to interpret that as like, if I could make one change to the DC tax code. Okay, so, I mean, through the lens of the research that I just presented, the way to raise abundant revenue for the District of Columbia is you can kind of break this into two pieces. First, look at the chunk of DC that's already, what I'm calling my research and activity center. Okay, so like the third of the city that's like the commercial core, and then like a few other nodes like Columbia Heights or whatever. Look at those nodes and optimize them, right? Like that's the single most valuable asset that we have in the city, economically speaking. And is it maximized? As it stands right now. So that's everything from, like light retoolings, like, adaptive reuse of some underused structures, or things like that, to like kind of like big, potentially transformative projects that seem like they're having a really hard time getting moving, but could unleash a lot more growth in the city. Like, for example, Union Station, like immediately comes to mind. But, we've already seen what it's done for DC's tax base to have really marginal land uses like concrete storage turned into incredibly productive and inclusive places like Capitol Riverfront. So, so looking at that piece and just, making sure that we're making the most of it is the first thing. Like some really kind of small levers to pull in there from a tax perspective. This may speak to sort of the bigger regulatory ecosystem that might be outside, it might go through here. And then the second piece is to look at the chunk of the city that is the majority of the city that is not an activity center of any kind, but is the land in the region that has the highest accessibility to the most powerful activity center in the region. That land, a lot of it is, I know I'm talking about my own house and a lot of other people's houses, but it is marginally used, right? And so you referenced zoning earlier, okay? And that is one piece of the puzzle, both when you're talking about optimizing downtown and about outside of the core, right? The constraints on growth in the district are why our suburbs are so highly evolved. This is the only place in the world where you'll see a teeny city surrounded by skyscraper suburbs. It's very weird. It's not economically natural. And that's growth that we give away to neighboring jurisdictions because of constraints in the core, like the HIDE Act, and constraints on institutional growth, like putting limits on Howard and GW. I mean, those are the talent engines that are fueling our regional economy. And firms locate here to be near the talent that's coming out of those institutions, right? And it's more important in the future economy than ever. I mean, also literally children are our future, but so looking at that piece, the role of the tax code is to get out of the way of growth in the sense that there is kind of this there could be a sort of maximum mass in terms of taxes that gets in the way of growth and becomes another constraint. And then although you have to look relatively I don't think we're actually in any danger of that, property taxes here are, it's really striking to me actually to see Dr. Pinto's IRS, the IRS data on moves, right? People are leaving DC to move to, Prince George's County was one of the top 3 destinations, and both the property and income tax burdens are higher there. So that was really striking to me that there's no way people are leaving just because of taxes. So looking at the rest of DC outside the core, right? The tax code, entitlements, changing zoning, that's one way to incentivize growth, but you also have to penalize the opposite of growth, which is lower productivity land uses. So you need the carrot and the stick, and if you're going to change it, the tax code piece should change at the same time as the entitlements piece. So there's a need for close coordination here, and that's a message that I'm happy to repeat for council. Given that there's a comprehensive plan process right on the horizon, that is a huge opportunity to align with the work of this commission. But if the opportunity is missed, you can't just do one and not the other, because otherwise, the net will be basically no change.
In terms of this giving up growth, former staff member of the Federal City Council visited Paris in a land area smaller than DC. Paris has 3.5 times the population, because even though they also have a height limit, there's much more distribution of density throughout the city. So that kind of goes to, we're giving up a lot for a number of reasons, not just the general height limitation, but how we allocate within that limitation as well.
Are we taxing yards enough?
I'm not.
Is my question.
Okay.
But also, if you think of Ward 6 versus Ward 3, the density in Ward 6 is much higher. And nobody looks at the capital area and says,
I wasn't
this place
thinking
is
so
dump.
much of taxes. I was thinking, although we're the tax commission, I was just thinking, it's like housing affordability. You're trying to produce housing affordability. On the one hand, you're squishing down supply with extreme demand, and you're just trying to, do what you can to subsidize the high costs you've created by squishing down on the supply.
Let me give Dr. Turnick a chance to answer that question and then go to our next question from Commissioner, I think Erica has her hand up and then other wishes want to get it, David and Greg. But Dr. Turnick, why don't you weigh in on the key question from Michelle? Of what one policy would you recommend that we take a particularly close look at? Oh, he's not there. We lost him. Okay.
You thought we were gonna tax his yard.
Yeah. We'll come back if he returns. Erica.
Thanks. Thanks so much for the presentations. This is really, really interesting. I have like just a couple of questions and I'll just throw them out there and y'all can figure out how you want to answer them. But one is, and maybe this is more for you, Dr. Pinto, but is, you know, you were talking about the sort of STAR study, and I wonder with some of those studies showing that taxes had an impact on migration, if those are net of the impact of any revenue decline and what that might have cost, you know, what the trade-off might have been. And then I guess that kind of segues to a broader question I have, which is just how do we think about, you know, we talked about this being an activity center, it being like a talent, you know, we have these talent generating universities, but we also have a lot of people in the district who I think are basically untapped. There's a lot of untapped potential with the level of poverty and inequality that we have here in the district. Our poverty rates may be similar to the US on a whole, but if you look at the single largest racial group, if you look at Black poverty in the district, it's almost 28%. So I'm just curious about like how you find the balance between you know, the desire to kind of like attract talent and to attract people to the district, businesses and so forth, activity, and the, you know, what we could gain from investing in people that live here, but are sort of, you know, haven't had the chance to live up to their full potential, haven't had the chance to become as economically sort of active in our city. So that's a question I have. And then I just, you know, sort of similar to Yeshim's question, like, what is it that we need to do? And maybe when Dr. Turnick comes back, he can take a crack at this to make ourselves more resilient to moments like this, where we go through kind of uncomfortable transitional periods, or we have to kind of adapt to new circumstances. Like, what are some tax changes that can just kind of keep us afloat while we figure out what the right other things we need to do are. Thanks.
Thanks, sir. Dr. Pinto, you want to go first and then Dr. Lowe?
Yes, sure. Yeah. So, you know, I did some work in the past on target, you know, place-based policies, on targeted policies to specifically distressed areas, right? And usually I came up with one message. There are two ways of doing local development policy. One is the fast way and easy way, sort of, and the other one is the long-term way, right? So you can design a policy that replaces all the local poor people with rich people that come from outside, you know, and then you test that policy a year from now, and that will be a great policy, right? Because that you know, according to indicators, you will see that poverty went down, you know, and all the things are improved. But it's not because you really solve the problems of local people. It's just that they were displaced, right? And then the other, the long-term implication is like work hard, you know, on trying to get long-term results, right? And that's more difficult, more challenging, and I think that involves something that goes beyond, and this is what I want to say, goes beyond the tax policy, right? It's just it goes beyond what the ability of the tax policy to be able to accomplish. The issue, the question that you were asking, they were not focusing. I mean, these are the studies that I was saying. They are very, you know, I don't know how scalable they are because they are referring to a specific type of individuals that we are targeting with the policy. You know, either those in the inventors or scientists that are kind of superstars to some extent. So in those cases, kind of the impact on revenue was kind of negligible. But I think it's a point well taken, because as you know, the typical race to the bottom argument basically is that jurisdictions get into this kind of race and they lower taxes, and at the end they end up offering or supplying a lower level. I mean, they have lower revenue and they have lower revenue for other things, right? So that's I mean, one thing to think, and again, I don't have, I mean, when I was asked about one specific thing, so if I put it in the context of what I see in the United States, so for instance, there's a lot more predominant reliance on charges, on general charges, right? And relatively the reliance on but that's not a tax source, right? That's part of the general revenue, right? The DC kind of relies relatively low on that, on general charges. Now, it is something that, I mean, general charges include, as you may know, include tuition from universities, some stuff that you pay to hospitals, perhaps parking meters, a lot of other things that are associated with the use of something, right? So there's a more direct relationship between what you pay and the benefit that you get as opposed to other taxes. So that might be something to consider. This is a sort of a way of exporting taxes, because usually a lot of the things that are used in the DC are from people that live outside, right? But in terms of relatively speaking, I think the reliance on general charges is relatively low in DC compared to other places.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I'd also like to jump in on this one. Thank you for asking this question, because this is actually what really motivates me to be interested in these sort of bigger questions about growth, right? That like we have a really deep need to do something about concentrated poverty. It's not just a moral mandate, but to your point, concentrated poverty it's a constraint on growth, because actually I'm talking about downtown DC as our greatest asset, but really actually people are our greatest asset. And it's it's especially true of children, but it's true of all people. So my center recently published another paper called Indicators of Inclusive Prosperity, where we did like a big data science analysis of every census tract in every metro area in the United States, looking at neighborhoods that had concentrated poverty in 2000. And then looking at the trajectory of those neighborhoods over 17 years. We stopped at the 2017 American Community Survey. And what that paper found is that two of the indicators that are strongly associated with inclusive growth, which is reducing poverty without displacement, right? Like, because one way to reduce poverty is just to move more people, which is not good. So we found two of the things that we found that are strongly associated with inclusive growth are if a neighborhood with concentrated poverty is located in a county that is experiencing economic growth. So in other words, the pie is getting bigger. And if the neighborhood itself is adding new housing. So I really appreciate you asking this question, because I think that a lot of people who care about neighborhoods and the people who live in them who are experiencing concentrated poverty are concerned that strong regional economic growth and building new housing actually cause displacement. And what we found in this paper is that they do not necessarily cause displacement, that they are necessary ingredients to reducing poverty. So this is a complicated topic, right? Place-based policy and exactly how to get it right. But I personally don't believe, based on the evidence I've seen, that we can get it right without growth of both the economy and of housing.
Thank you. Dr. Chernick, I know you had to step away for a moment. Are you back? Let's see here. Okay.
Mr. Catania, thank you. I really appreciate all the presenters. I have a slightly different approach towards budgeting and towards taxation. that isn't backward looking, but more forward looking. I don't mean that pejoratively. And often research is a function of what has happened and not what should happen. And so what I'm interested in is a tax system that prioritizes growth, that prioritizes opportunity, and all the things that we want to see associated with that, more than simply looking at what has happened in the past. So, going forward, any ideas for us to, or any articles or any things you would want us to take a look at, or you have at your disposal on creating what kind of tax structure is going to facilitate a bigger pie. I want to borrow a phrase from Desmond Tutu about the ability to talk without taboo. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to talk about taxing people who are already taxed, one of the taboos is taxing people who are not. And I don't want to, any of the nonprofits in the room, please don't jump at me, but I think we have to be able to talk without taboo. If we're going to ask people who are the highest taxed in the country to pay more, while nonprofits have zero accountability for that tax privilege, zero accountability to the community for that tax benefit, why are we either, one, not imposing accountability on that privileged status, or two, looking to raise revenue if revenue doesn't matter? You cannot have it both ways. Just because we think we're special, show us you're special and create the framework to illustrate that privilege. I'm a big believer in deferred gratification. Our budgets are not exercises in deferred gratification. They're exercises in election cycles where people distribute and they're not thinking long-term about investments. And so a tax structure that privileges investment, that can be a counter to a political council, to me, is interesting. And so, let me just say, I appreciate the remarks, but I want to go back to the first speaker about the migration of these 8,000 returns, because they ain't the same. And if we're talking about them as the same, they ain't the same. Someone who decided to move to a lesser expensive county to save money, Prince George's County, is not necessarily the same as the taxpayer who moved to Miami among these 8,000. You understand what I'm saying? And these are not equal, obviously in the eyes of the Lord, but not in the eyes of, Mr. Lee here, who's got to collect the money to run the ship. So I need to know more about that. And I'd like to see a system that, and the advice from our experts on how do we create an opportunity tax code, not just a redistribution tax code. And thank you for the diatribe. That's a serious question. I want to know, do we know who these 8,000 are based on how much they put in the tip?
Can I ask you a question?
Yep.
When you say tax nonprofits, are you thinking of like a gross receipts tax? Because there is no profit in nonprofits to be taxed by corporate income taxes.
Well,
so are you thinking like a gross receipts tax like the NFL baseball?
Well, there's a great illustration of a head tax from the good people of Seattle that could be applied to nonprofits, number one. Number two, there is nothing sacred about simply a broad tax privilege that gives you nonprofits the ability to get money tax-free.
So should we let these folks?
Yeah.
So I think there's
Let me
two.
press this if you don't mind, just
Well,
one second.
I got your question.
But she asked and I'm responding, that there's nothing that says, there's nothing written in the Constitution that says nonprofits get to be exempt from the district's tax code. Nothing. And that the money donated to them is exempt in perpetuity.
I'm asking the mechanism. I'm not asking about your
Yeah.
ideology, just the mechanism.
Well, there are many mechanisms, and that's what I'm asking. If we're gonna talk about raising revenue. My last point, and I promised to shut up about this, is this. One of the reasons why the mayor and I fought so much about tax reductions in the past wasn't an ideological one, it was a government efficiency one. But unless you put constraints on the government, it will spend its last nickel and not wisely. We were able to do great things when you were mayor and when I was on the council, because among other things, there was oversight. And there were some people who looked at things like, why a Department of Health that had 600 employees had 3,000 landlines? No, I'm not kidding. How do you have 600 employees and 3,000 landlines? Yeah. That kind of stuff. We have zero, if you just keep finding money to fill the engine, no one looks to see how the money is being spent. And how is it that we're the most taxed in the country and we still have 40% of our people on Medicaid? Because people just take the money, they feel good about it, and no one looks around to see, did it go where it was supposed to? Do we have any accountability? Sorry for the diatribe.
So do you, so I think there's two questions to respond to. One is about the role of nonprofits, nonprofits in DC versus others don't pay property taxes here. In other words, what does the research say about the role of those in economic growth? And then the other question, Dr. Pinto, was around I think it's specifically about the chart on page 13, inflow and outflow data, and how the folks migrating in compare and contrast with the folks migrating out. So I don't know, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. Okay, so this first question about taxing nonprofits. Look, to be honest with you, this is a topic that's coming up in a lot of the cities where I've been talking to people. The primary mechanism that I hear people talking about to address this is negotiating payment in lieu of taxes or pilot with large nonprofit institutions. So, when people talk about DC's tax base, they often bring up like, oh my God, like how much untaxable land there is within the district's boundaries because of like how much belongs to the government, et cetera. But it's also these big nonprofit institutions that are major landowners. And that is something that DC has in common, for example, with Philadelphia. So, payment in lieu of taxes is something people are talking about. People are negotiating it. Once again, there's a general awareness that like nothing is free, that services cost money, right? And people are open to having the conversation. So that's just one tool, perhaps, for the commission to consider. That said, another thing I want to bring up about nonprofits is that another of the indicators of inclusive growth that we found in one of our recent papers, which it sounds like I should share, is that was important to yielding growth without reducing poverty without displacement, is the presence in a neighborhood of community-based organizations. So I do just want to go on the record and say nonprofits are good. Obviously, I work at one, so I have a perspective on that. But there is some evidence to back up my assertion as well. That said, another of the indicators of inclusive growth that we found in this paper was high rates of self-employment. And so as the commission is thinking about how to grow the pie and grow the pie inclusively, something that's really important to look at is to just ask yourself the question, is DC the easiest place in the country to start a new enterprise, a new small business? Obviously, the answer to that question involves things other than taxes, but taxes is probably part of the answer to that question. And so it's something really important to look at because entrepreneurship is how you grow the pie.
I agree.
Did we hear though that there was really no response to changes in corporate tax rates? That doesn't have impact.
So that was Dr. Pinto's presentation. And so I want to defer to him if he wants to answer that
Yeah,
question.
because I was going to ask that too, what the difference between personal property and corporate taxes? Because they're different.
Commercial.
Yeah, commercial and personal property, right?
Yeah, and Dr. Pinto had a slide that specifically spoke to that. So I want to defer to him if he wants to jump in.
Sorry, what was the question exactly? Sorry about that.
You had a slide where you looked at the where actually I'm not sure you even got to this in your, maybe I just saw it in the deck that I reviewed in advance about
It's on
like
page 15.
yeah, corporate taxes and how that influences location decisions.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, definitely. So this is part of a literature that research that I've done in the past that has to do with fiscal competition, basically. Like the fiscal competition, especially in corporate net income taxes, in the past has focused on the levels of the tax rates. Now, the level of the tax rate, of corporate tax rate, overall, they have declined a lot across states in the United States. But there's still competition in other more subtle parts of the state corporate income taxes. And one of the things, for instance, that I did in my research is look at how, for instance, how the corporate tax is apportioned across states. And so in like 50 years ago, we started with the Multi-Tax Act saying that states should apportion the corporate income tax equally according to 3 factors: sales, property, and employment. That was a suggestion. Throughout the years, what we see is, for instance, that the apportionment part has now tended to focus on exclusively on the sales proportion, how much part. So the total profit is actually apportioned across states according to how much you sell in that particular state. So actually, what I claim in my research is that actually the competition across localities have induced to these changes in the apportionment formula. So the thing that I see right now is that the competition across states is kind of a lot more subtle right now. It's not really in something that is really clearly observable like the tax rates, but on a lot of the ingredients behind, underlying the tax. And one is the apportionment portion, but also is how you define the tax base, whether you include, how you include depreciation, and so on and so forth. Now, having said so, this portion of the corporate tax that is part of the tax revenue is relatively small. I think to some extent in Washington D.C. is a little bit higher relative to the neighboring states, to Maryland and Virginia. So that's something to think about. But again, it looks like this is something that has been reducing in importance throughout the years across places. So let me just point one other thing is that. I tend to think of a tax system at the local level, also from above, saying, okay, what would be a tax system, right, that prevents this just wasteful reallocation of resources? If you have individual locations kind of trying to attract the locality, businesses to their own area at the expense of others. And this is what some of the research that I mentioned at the beginning showed, is that a lot of the scientists that are attracted to the low-income places are those, it's just a reallocation. It's not that it creates new scientists or locally new scientists or new inventors. So I'm sure that there's a way of defining that. And I think there might be some incompatibility between how you think the federal, like from an aggregate point of view, how do you think about the local government taxation, and I suppose how you think like a locality that you have incentives to act in a particular way. So I'm sure that even for the locality, there are ways of structuring the tax system in a way that tries to address some of these issues, but there will always be some problems and some spillovers and some things that are created. And again, I still hesitant of how you can do it without coordinating a little bit with the counties or the cities around you, basically.
Gregory, I think you're next.
Okay. Maybe you guys.
I would like to get, I didn't really, and it's not criticizing Dr. Pinto, I just didn't really understand because of the sound and we need to talk about the logistics, but anyway, I didn't really understand. So when somebody has to, because of the sound, somebody has to reiterate his point for me at least, because I think it was a very important point into important questions.
If it's not what we want to deep dive into. Maybe when we want to deep dive into, maybe not tonight,
Yeah.
but it feels like some of the evidence that people are going to, where you see most job creation is lower income, lower tax. And the data, I think, maybe it's wrong, but the data absence, that's where job formation has been happening, but probably something to help us.
Yeah, I feel like we probably need a whole session and literature review on migration, because I think he's presented a number of important papers on this topic, but you can imagine there's a whole raft of economic research on migration, and it's It's a pretty complicated.
Right, and it's important to
Sure.
consider not just like tax burden, but like aggregate total cost. Right, so like
Yeah.
property taxes are very high in Prince George's County, but because property values are lower, it's a lower cost jurisdiction to live in, for example. And like broadly across Sunbelt, the cost of living is lower.
I also think it's important, like you said, too, with entrepreneurship and starting our regulation. And we've had that debate here, probably still a debate, but it's not just taxes, it's also regulation and needs to.
Does that make sense to put that on the table for a
Yes.
future? Add to the list. It's already, I think we already had at least one session around such a conversation.
Okay, I had a question about basically equity and the sales tax. So I'm referring to page 25 in Dr. Pinto's study. And there's a study here that says DC is among the most progressive, lowest inequality among the states. Yet our sales tax, which I think is the most aggressive tax, is high. And there's also a slide at the beginning, I think, that says the per capita burden of the sales tax in DC is dramatically higher than the national average as well as the suburbs. So how can that be true? And how can we then be the lowest level of tax regressivity? And then sort of related to that is, I think you said, putting words in your mouth, that people want to live near places. So Capitol Riverfront, 14th Street, Noma, Union Market, when people do cool things, people are willing to come there and they know they're going to pay more. And that you said the driver here was not so much sales taxes as a disincentive or property taxes, but more income tax. So if we wanted to look at the sales tax, how could we, putting it crudely, do more sales tax, but somehow keep this low level of tax regressivity? So we have the highest tax now and apparently the lowest tax regressivity. So what could we do to catch all those people that want to live in and near Jody's beautiful places at Union Market, yet aren't so worried about property or business taxes or income taxes, but they're willing to pay more sales tax?
Great question. I'm happy to also defer to Dr. Pinto here. I will just say right off the top that one of the ways that jurisdictions try to get at this in a progressive way is to not think of the sales tax as a blanket tax, but to target specific kinds of consumption and then also exempt specific kinds of consumption. So for example, in the district, there's no sales tax on diapers. Right. There is in Maryland, but in the district, there's not. And that's something that helps the parents of young children. That's a progressive thing to do. Targeting taxes on alcohol, for example, is one way to target a very particular kind of consumption, and to kind of get at wanting to tax those who can afford to be spending their time and treasure that way, while sparing those who drink less. Targeting out of town consumption, like for example, like taxes related to hotels and hospitality. There's a lot of ways to slice and dice sales tax. Jurisdictions tend to get very, very sophisticated about this. I've been spending a lot of time in New York talking to folks up there about their tax structure, and it's a very complicated matrix there in terms of thinking about consumption taxes broadly. So I would just encourage the panel to not think of it as a single number and to think about targeting.
And maybe Dr. Pinto could just talk about, I think the chart in the front here said that the per capita burden of the sales tax in DC was dramatically higher than the national average and the suburbs. Yet we have this wonderful thing here that says we do equity better than most places. So are those conflicting things, or?
I'll hand it over to Dr.
How
Pinto.
is
He may
that
have just been referring to DC's income tax structure, but I don't want to speak for him.
No, so yeah, no, I think this goes back to what Tracy was saying. So just looking at variability on exclusivity on tax rate across states is kind of misleading because of how the tax base is defined. And one of the things that DC has is some exemptions, like groceries are exempted from sales taxes. And that's tend to make the system quite progressive. But let me emphasize one thing. What the research shows is that the intervention, just the state and local taxes, their intervention tends to make the system more regressive. I mean, it's just because of this kind of thing. So in a way, what DC is less regressive by implementing these measures. Okay, so because when you do more in terms of exempting some of the tax bases. Now, in terms of Washington DC, basically the highest per capita tax revenue is individual taxes, well, property taxes and individual taxes, and then it sales taxes. Okay, and again, it has been showing that, as I was saying, overall in the US, but also in many other places, the tax collection of sales taxes per capita has still been growing, but at a lower pace relative to other taxes. And that has been related to what I was saying before, because it's been harder to tax sales because, again, they can who's going to withhold the sales taxes, and there's a whole thing about the Wayfair lawsuit and that kind of stuff. And then all the other things is about how do you introduce taxes on services. It's become a lot more problematic, right? And a lot of the states differ in terms of which services have to pay sales taxes and which ones not. And there's a lot of variation there. And it's harder to tax those sales, again, also because where do you tax the sale, where the person, where you're provided or where you're getting it. So there are a lot of problems related to that has made, the tax base of this has been becoming a lot more complicated to levy on.
Can I just have one follow-up question on that, on this question about sales taxes? Would I be correct in saying that the sales taxes per capita revenue, that sales tax is paid by both people who live in the district and are shopping here, but also tourists, visitors, commuters, and so on, whereas the data on regressivity is focusing on DC residents?
Yeah, that's right. Yes. That's right. Yeah. Basically, I mean, it's true that sales tax is paid at regular, right? So forget about buying online and those kind of things. It's paid at the destination, right? And it may be paid. It might be a way of exporting taxes, because if you have a lot of people coming from outside, they will be paying a lot of sales taxes, and that's what's one of the challenges that DC has been facing with the remote work, is that we have a lot of less commuters that will be buying coffees and those kind of things. But then the issues measure at, the income level is measured not on the person who pays, because we don't know that, but the location where that takes place. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a few more questions. Any of the commissioners who haven't raised a question want to jump in? You have another question? Want to finish this up? No? All right.
I mean, one distinction of the, I think, in the district sales tax, other than we is that we keep all the sales tax. For instance, if you're in Alexandria somewhere, sales tax in the city, I don't know the percentage, but they keep a much smaller percentage than the district would keep sales tax.
Should I say more?
Yeah, no, we get 100% of it.
Yeah, because it's a state sales tax.
Yeah.
Is it what, sorry?
There's a state sales tax in most states.
I just would say I appreciate anything from the experts that could help shed light on how we create, a tax code that is forward-thinking, forward-looking, opportunity-focused, including incentives for small businesses and for entrepreneurship. That would be really fascinating, because that's what we've been tasked to do, is to construct a system that is going to be kind of opportunity-focused. So
Yeah.
I welcome that.
I would be, actually, it's a good segue to David's question. I'd be interested in whether you've done any research with Dr. Pinto on states for these purposes, or cities, but really states where you could correlate their tax policy, if you can, and reduction of poverty. So here in DC, despite our best efforts, we've spent a lot of money and we really haven't made a dent in concentration of poverty. I've been a part of it a lot, and we haven't. So have there been some states where they have actually made a dent? And to what extent could we correlate that with their tax structure? So for example, you could say, well, maybe they had more economic growth and more housing production. So actually, yeah, I'd be interested. You don't have to answer it now, but if one of you could look at that.
I would be delighted to share the paper that we just published on what moves the needle on concentrated poverty, because it sounds like this is a topic of really general
But
interest.
well, did you find some states that actually have moved the needle?
Yeah.
Okay.
So I would be happy to share that. We found the kind of core nugget of analysis. The paper focuses on 200 neighborhoods in the United States that between 2000 and 2017 had reductions in their poverty rate without population loss or displacement. So
You did it
it's out there.
without bringing in new people out, just gentrification.
Actually, in many cases, this did involve new people moving in, but without loss of population, it's without loss of people of color or old. So I'd be more than happy to share that paper. This is brand new research, so it has not gotten in front of a lot of eyeballs yet. and
I
I'd be
think
happy
we
to
all
share.
love to see it.
Yeah, happy to share that.
That'd be awesome.
We already.
What was the tax rate?
So I've already talked about this paper a little bit today, right? That two of the indicators of inclusive growth were overall a bigger picture, like county level context of economic growth, and high rates of self-employment in neighborhoods. So that speaks to entrepreneurship. Adding new housing is what's associated with both with reducing poverty and preventing displacement. What haven't I mentioned? Lower rates of violent crime.
Well, where are the places? Like, is it?
Oh, these 200 neighborhoods are all over, and they're. That's a good question. I will have to look at the paper and get back to you on that.
I mean, you're reducing the rate, you said it's a rate poverty, because you can bring in the people and poverty rate goes down.
Right, so we actually specifically look at that in the paper and show that the changes in these neighborhoods come from just like a slight shift in literally like a rising tide lifting all boats.
Tracy, when you say neighborhood, what level is this?
Census tract. Census tract.
Yeah.
Nick, it seems as though like David did it first, but we mentioned entrepreneurship a lot. So it looks as though we're gonna have recommendations at the end of this about entrepreneurship. That seems to be common thread among all of our aspirations.
Yeah, I think it's super important to look at. The other thing that I mentioned that I'm hearing from other cities right now is that cities are getting really creative at looking at new sources of revenue that they can create, rather than just like trying to fine tune existing sources or like squeeze blood from the stone. Innovative cities are really like pushing ahead with just creating whole new sources of revenue. Like for example, Chicago is now taxing cannabis, which is obviously not an option here, but thinking big about creating new sources of revenue. And then the other thing that really impressed me on my trip to Chicago is that they actually beat New York to implementing congestion pricing in a way by or a congestion tax by putting a ring around their downtown and charging ride hails to an extra fee to cross the ring.
Is Chicago not generally covered with city intertwined?
So I think that until extremely recently, that was true. But if you look at general fund receipts in the last 2 years, you will see that Chicago has a new leadership team that is doing amazing things, both to address the overall physical picture of the city, but also to really deeply invest in disinvested neighborhoods. I think what's happening in Chicago right now is actually a national model. Well, Chicago has a problem with crime. That is a bigger picture conversation for another day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that.
Thanks so much, David.
Thank you.
All of our speakers.
When can we expect it?
We will circulate this paper.
Yeah, I mean.
Oh, okay.
It's already written, it's already polished.
Perfect.
Share right away.
And I think we've identified a number of good topics for us to dig into.
What do you think of?
And we will see you all on the 17th.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.